Can't hear you, Jeff.
Myself. Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome to the From Genesis to Jesus. And I just wanted to welcome everybody. And what I'll do is I'll be admitting people in and they'll come in with mute. And I'm going to turn over to Reverend Charles. He's going to explain how this is all going to happen. And first of all, welcome. And I'll just turn off my mic and my video.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you, Jeff, from the Swing Point Media producers booth. We appreciate you so much helping put this together and facilitate it. Good morning, Center for Spiritual Living Palm Desert and friends, wherever you're joining us from this morning. It's a good Monday morning, and we're blessed once again to have Michael Bogar with us, who's been a teacher of mine for a long time. I'll give you a little more information on him in just a moment if you aren't familiar with him yet. As far as we're broadcasting on a number of different platforms this morning. So a couple things can happen while Michael's presenting. If you have a question or a comment and you want to make that known while he's presenting, you can type it into the chat box and Jeff and Michael will be able to see those questions. And if you'd like to weigh in verbally, you can, from time to time, Michael's style is that he'll ask and say, he'll ask a question and give a pause. And at that point in time, if you could unmute yourself and raise your question or make your comment and then remute yourself so that it's not a chaotic environment, that would be great. So everybody's going to be on mute. If you have something to say, unmute yourself. And then once you're done, remute yourself. That'll keep for a clean environment here for us. So those are the logistics of that. So Michael Bogar has been a teacher for decades now. 30 years, maybe 25, 30 years, maybe longer. I know he taught me in my years of seminary, world religions, metaphysical Bible, all sorts of things really, and was quite formative in my theological upbringing, if you will, in my formal training. And what's awesome too is that when I ask him, hey, Michael, will you come back on and present to our community? He says, well, what do you want me to present? I say, how about, Jesus and being a revolutionary during these, times of the COVID and this and that. And he's like, no, Charles, really, what do you want me to present? And then it ends up being this 45 minutes to an hour theological conversation about what the information we really want to get across here. And that's who Michael is. He's a deep diver, makes me think, challenges me. And I pray that he does the same for you so that in all the information he presents, you get to draw your own conclusions about your own life. And that's what I really appreciate about his style. He always challenges me to be, to think deeper and be more of myself. So ladies and gentlemen, enough of me. I'm going to turn this over to Michael. Let's have a great ride this morning. Michael Bogar, ladies and gentlemen.
Great. Thank you, Charles, so much.
You're welcome.
All right. So where to begin? This is such a huge topic and such a short time. Let me just give you a little bit of background about why this idea, reading the Bible, Genesis to Jesus, has come to me over the years. I was raised in a home with no religion. At the age of 19, I became a Christian, went to seminary, became a minister, taught in a Christian seminary for a while, and then left that and went out and partied and went crazy and found a church called the Religious Science Church that allowed me to be crazy and party and still pursue spirituality. So my life has been kind of all over the place. I mean, I've had a lot of different experiences. And what I found is that no single group really could encompass my life and all my life experiences. I like the Center for Spiritual Living piece, the New Thought piece, but for me, it didn't completely cover some of the things going on in my life. So I got hold of a book by Scott Peck. Probably a lot of you have read Scott Peck stuff. The book called The Different Drum. And in The Different Drum, he talks about 4 stages of spiritual growth. And we're going to look at those in a few moments. But as I read that, I realized that I had been going through those 4 stages of spiritual growth, and they're really different. They're not, your stereotypical mysticism. Mysticism is one stage of growth, but it's just one stage of spirituality, one kind of spirituality. So as I began to read the Bible with Scott Peck's ideas in mind, I began to see that the Bible itself is written and progresses through stages. God's relationship with Israel and the people of the Bible changes. There's different modes or perspectives in each section of the Bible. So that's the perspective that we're going to look at here today. And I think that many of you will see these stages and modes of consciousness applying throughout your whole life, even before you were at CSL Seattle or CSL Palm Desert. Yes, Palm Desert. Yeah. So with that background, let's jump in. I'm going to put the PowerPoint slides up so we can kind of stay on track. And get back to my beginning. Everybody see that okay? Or the people who can see it, Charles? Good? All right. So here's an image that sort of summarizes the whole thing. I think a beautiful image of a human being as a sort of seed pod. And I'm imagining this is the soul or psyche, spirit, whatever you want to call it. I think there's distinctions there, but let's just, that invisible part of us that gets planted in the soil of this earth, and we're here to grow. So the title, From Genesis to Jesus, reading the Bible as 4 stages and 4 modes of spiritual growth. Now we're going to make a distinction here in a few minutes between stages and modes, but just keep in mind, well, let me just say out of the gate, stages has to do with a kind of sequential steps, linear steps, moving from one stage to the next, kind of a moving up, if you will. Modes, on the other hand, are just different ways of seeing things in life. There's different modes of consciousness or perspectives. So we're going to look at the Bible as showing stages of development, but also modes of seeing things. This will make more sense as we move. Now, this idea is found in the teachings of Jesus, this idea of spiritual development or the process of spiritual growth in stages. A little known parable, Mark chapter 4. I'm going to read the whole thing here. It's very short. I've never heard a sermon on it from anyone. Jesus said, "This is what the kingdom of God is like." Now think in terms of kingdom of God as the spiritual life, if you will. Here's what Jesus says the kingdom of God is like. A farmer scatters seed on the ground. Got the image? Night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. All by itself, and in the Greek, which the New Testament is written in, it's automate, automatic. All by itself, the seed sprouts and grows. The soil produces grain, and then it gives the stages of this seed sprouting. First, the stalk. Second, the head. Third, the full kernel in the head. As soon as the grain is ripe, he puts the sickle to it because the harvest has come. Very short parable, but essentially it says the spiritual life proceeds in stages like a seed. The seed looks different in different aspects of its development. So I'm suggesting here, and this is going to be our approach, as we read the Bible, we're going to see that human beings are like seeds, soul seeds, if you will, and that we look like different people at different stages of our life. And even in different modes during a single day, we can be in different mindsets and different perspectives. And we'll see what those perspectives are. But this is the kind of background from Jesus. The kingdom of heaven grows like a seed. I'm suggesting that the soul, your soul, my soul, grows like a seed. So here's a summary of the biblical narrative. You know, usually I do this class and it's an 8-week, 3-hour-a-night class. So we're getting the really quick version here. So I'm just going to give you this very quick summary. In this summary of the Bible as a narrative, as a story, I'm not reading the Bible as a book of metaphysics. That's fine. There's a place for that. I'm not reading the Bible as a book of theology. This is not Baptist theology, Catholic theology. It's not New Thought metaphysics. It's a narrative. And in this narrative, the garden image is important because it has the idea of the human being planted as a seed. Remember, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like a farmer planting the seed in the garden. Well, here the seed is the human being. It's each of us. And the garden is this earth, this entire earthly experience. So Eden is a garden because the Hebrews viewed each human soul as a divinely animated seed pod that must germinate and grow. All experiences on this earth comprise the soil for your soul seed to gestate and gradually grow into a unique self as an image of God. This earth soil is made up of the countless inner and outer experiences that occur during the lifetime, or if you're into reincarnation, many lifetimes, to cause your soul seed to sprout and grow. I emphasize that souls develop through innumerable relationships. So the relationships that we have are the soil. That comprises the soil for our soul seeds to grow. Relationships with people, and we have lots of those, good and bad. Relationship with places, geography. Palm Desert is different than Seattle. Objects, cars, houses, computers, myriad objects that we have relationships with in this garden. Ideas, this is the internal soil. Our thoughts daily, we have hundreds, if not thousands of thoughts each day. Our dreams at night, our fantasies, our anxieties, our reflections. Our emotions are part of the soil, pleasurable and painful, depression, ecstasy, fear, anxiety. All of the emotions are part of the soil. So there's no emotion that isn't part of the soul-making soil. All of our life situations, the birth that we go through, the aging process that we all go through, our gains and losses. Sometimes we get things, we're excited, we really love what we've gained. Other times we lose things, people, places, things, and all the myriad changes we go through, part of the soil that we grow in. We will discover that the biblical narrative from Genesis to Jesus identifies four distinct, and I believe universal, and we'll look at why I think that, universal stages or perspectives or modes that each of us must experience, and emphasize must experience, in order to become a unique soul, a distinct individual. So are you with me so far? Anybody have any questions or comments up to this point? I'm taking that to be a no. All right, so let's carry on. As we move from Genesis to Revelation, and for those of you who are not familiar with the Bible, Genesis is the first book. For Christians, it's called the Old Testament. For the Hebrews, it's called Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, all the way through the Kings and Chronicles and the poetic books, Psalms and Job, etc., and then the prophets, and then into the New Testament where we have Jesus, the book of Revelation. All the way through, from Genesis to Revelation, we will view the many biblical characters, starting with Adam and Eve, and going all the way through, and there are hundreds of different characters. We'll look at all of those characters and all of their situations, whether it's, Sarah and Abraham having a baby, King David and Bathsheba, whatever the situations. All of them we will read as symbolic examples, as universal patterns, aka archetypes, necessary for deepening souls and for spiritual development. In other words, just as you would read any good story, we see the characters develop. We see Israel develop. And they are symbols of our own development, our own soul-making seed unfolding. So in this view, there's a sense in which God grows up in you as a distinct individual. Now, obviously, God doesn't grow up, or maybe God does, I don't know. But our focus here is God growing up or developing in each of us through different stages of life. Whether you're in quote unquote religious or not, this view suggests that God is always growing up in us in every emotion, thought, situation, relationship, every circumstance. God is growing up in us. Now, Thomas Troward. You guys study Troward, Charles? Yes?
Yes. Yep.
All right. So Thomas Troward says this in his book, Bible Mystery and Bible Meaning. The story of the fall, and this is the story of, Adam and Eve in the garden, and the fall is when they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The story of the fall brings us to the wrapping or enveloping of the spiritual nature in what he calls the lower intellectual and material animal natures. Through this process of mingling spirit and matter, that is, this physical body and the physical world with the spiritual self, through this process of this mingling of matter and spirit alone can the soul obtain perfect individualization, and the human may become a reality instead of remaining only a divine dream. So Troward suggests that the biblical story is a story of spirit and matter mingling, so that this spiritual experience in this material garden, earth, is necessary to make a soul. Ernest Holmes says something similar in Science of Mind textbook when he says, we should have no difficulty in realizing that an infinite intelligence could not make an automatic individuality. In other words, God can't make you an individual by just snapping God's fingers and saying, there, Charles is a unique individual. No, how's it done? This explains why a human suffers on his or her road to self-discovery, because part of becoming an individual comes through the suffering. His or her suffering, Holmes says, is not God ordained, because she creates his or her own experience as you become individualized. So we could get into some discussion about that, but we're not. But Holmes' point here is that this earthly experience brings difficult experiences in order to individualize us. The only way God can evolve, now listen, Holmes is pretty dogmatic here. The only way God can evolve a spontaneous individual is to let him or her alone and allow him to awaken to their unique self. Comments, questions, observations, reactions? Quoting Pink Floyd, is there anybody out there? Anybody have any comments or questions?
This is Faye. Could I ask, incarnation then, do you feel that the soul or soul matters are preordained?
Soul what?
Soul development or the purpose of life is preordained. Pre-planned.
Yeah, I hear, yes. Destiny, fate. Yes. Let me answer this two ways. First of all, from a broader soul-making perspective, you asking that question and you and I engaging in a discussion around it is what it's about.
Okay.
Okay. So for me to give you an answer steps into the realm of theology and metaphysics. And I have an answer, I have an opinion, but that opinion is my experience to date. And I'm suggesting that the bigger soul seed is about you and I hearing each other and talking about it, and our souls are made in the discussion. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
Okay, so now moving to the second realm, my answer to your question is yes, I think fate and destiny are part of it.
Okay.
In the longer class, we have a whole session on this where we look at people like John Keats, the poet, where as he's dying of tuberculosis, he speculates in a letter to his brother that this is the veil of soul making, this life, that we go through the valley of soul making, and each of us has his or her own lessons written on the heart.
Yeah.
And
we walk the valley.
we go through the valley, but each of us has our own unique assignments. We talk about addictions, for example. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've been in recovery for 20 years now, and thank God for that. But my addiction or struggle with alcohol is not the struggle of most people. So, it's not like I woke up one morning and said, I think I'm going to become an alcoholic. Or people who have trouble with food or sex or whatever it happens to be. Keats would suggest that that might be a unique soul-making assignment given to each of us as individuals, because we become unique souls through our individual assignments. The Greeks called it fate. Every mythology that we know of has this notion of the gods giving us certain experiences. So is that in the ballpark, Faye, of what you're talking about?
For sharing that.
What's that?
I said, thank you for sharing that opinion.
Okay. Do you have something you want to say about it? What's your view there?
I'm testing my view against yours.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. But you don't have anything you want to share?
No.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Great question. Anyone else?
Michael, there's just a comment. It says, from Wandering Newbie, we are alone only as much as we perceive to be. What's your thought on that?
Yes. And my bigger question is, what is it in us that perceives to be alone? There's something in us that can perceive to be alone. I'm suggesting that is a valid aspect of soul making, because if we can perceive it, that perception is part of the soil. The New Thought movement, the beauty of the New Thought movement, as we're going to see, is it moves into the higher stages of development. And by higher, I don't mean better. I just mean more down the line. And we start to wake up and go, well, I'm going to change my perceptions. I don't want that perception anymore. But I'm suggesting that all perceptions in a soul-making experience are valid perceptions. If they're in the soil, they're valid perceptions to make soul. Now, that doesn't mean we're stuck in them, because as Holmes says here, as we become individualized, we can stop the suffering. But the suffering is part of a perspective toward individualization. Anything else on that?
There was a comment. How does free will or choice fit into this, Michael?
That's a good soul-making question. Really, I'm going to go there almost all the time, because what I want to emphasize is that soul-making is done in these interactions. The answers we come up with are always sort of temporary, important, but temporary. So again, my answer to that question right now, Charles, is that somehow they both work together. That's been my experience, that, the serenity prayer, there are some things I cannot change, and there are some things I can change. I need to have serenity for those situations that come that I can't change, and courage to change the things I can. And how's the serenity prayer end?
Wisdom to know the difference.
The wisdom to know the difference. When this assignment is mine and I can't get rid of it, and when I can get rid of it. So I think, fate and free will do this strange little dance that sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Anything else, Charles, on that? Or
that's all. That's the only comment that I saw.
Okay. All right. So let's move. This is Holmes. All right. So let's look at these stages and modes of consciousness as universal or archetypal patterns. What are these 4 stages? What are these 4 modes that we find in the Bible, and I think in lots of other places? So the question I want us to have in mind now is, can I find these 4 modes or these 4 stages in myself and in my own life? First of all, an image of the Hindu god Brahman, or Brahma, the creator god. 4 faces. To me, this is significant because it's suggesting that the gods have many faces or perspectives. And if we're made in the image of the gods, we have many perspectives in our own souls. So here's a chart that's going to go through these 4 stages and modes. I'm going to suggest, and again, in a soul-making perspective, this is for you to respond to in your own heart and soul. Perspective number 1 or stage number 1 or mode number 1 is simply ego. I. Stage number 2 is ego plus. We. Sometimes I call it we go. Stage number 3 or perspective number 3 is ego analyzed or explored, where I start asking questions. We'll make this more clear in a moment. Stage number 4 or mode number 4 is ego surrendered, or what we call the mystical mode. Now, let's look at how Scott Peck, what he says about these 4 stages. In the different drum, Scott Peck calls the ego stage or the ego perspective, and most of us have one. If we ever use the word I, you know you've got one. He calls it the chaotic antisocial stage of spiritual growth. In the ego mode, who's the center of the universe? I am the center of the universe. Now, oftentimes the ego gets a bad rap in many of our circles. We see it as the source of all problems, and it is. But without it, there's no spiritual growth. So the ego, in this view, is created in the Garden of Eden as Adam and Eve and little iPods. They're the first iPods. And those little ego pods are self-obsessed. In fact, all the characters in Genesis are self-obsessed, including God, because I believe the Hebrew narrative starts out with ego, and the book of Genesis is a book of egos, individuals. Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Jacob, Rachel, all these different individuals, because it's the stage where it's all about me. Scott Peck says this stage of self-obsession is great as a baby, as a child, as young people, but it gets old, especially around other people. That's why he calls it chaotic antisocial. He says after the ego grows for a while, it creates chaos. It creates chaos. Can you hang on one moment? Just hang on one moment here. Father's in the hospital and I'm getting a call. Can you just hang on for 30 seconds here?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, Michael, do your thing.
Reverend Charles, here's another question. If you might want to consider taking this question, it says,
Sure.
This is from Grateful Humanoid, says, my struggle comes when there are horrific events that cause suffering. Is it those who are the victims, ones that may be at a higher level of soul making, that they can move on from this earth?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to speak for Michael. I think we should bring that back up when he gets here, but I think it doesn't really have any, as far as the victims or the perpetrator aren't at different levels of soul making, that the whole process is soul making, that no matter that your experience of it is simply where you are in the process of becoming, and that we're constantly becoming. So, I think we also have a tendency to kind of keep score, higher consciousness, lower consciousness, things like that. But within an infinite, makeup, what score ultimately is there to keep? I mean, if you're a victim, I would say that there's information to be harvested there that can probably move you from victim into, more empowered, as part of your soul making process. And if you're a perpetrator of some travesty, then there's feedback there as well, as far as continuing to just awaken to what's really going on. That everything is simply a becoming more of ourselves, more and like if you look at the slide here, perspective 4 isn't better than perspective 1. And likely in any given day, we go through all 4 perspectives. We go through all 4 experiences in any given hour, you know, from an I choice of taking care of yourself to a mystical moment of having, you know, union and communion. So that's how I would answer that.
I'm back.
There he is.
I like your answer.
Oh, good. Thank you. Whenever I'm with Michael, I will always feel like I'm in school. That's just the way it's going to be. Thanks, teacher.
Yeah.
Will you add something since you
I missed the question, so I liked what you said, but I'm not sure what the question was.
Jeff,
would you read that question? My struggle comes when there are horrific events that cause suffering. Is it those who are the victims, ones that may be at a higher level of soul making, that they can move on from this earth?
I guess I'm not sure I completely understand the question. Could you read it one more time?
Sure. My struggle comes when there are horrific events that cause suffering.
Okay.
Is it those who are the victims, ones that may be at a higher level of soul making, that they can move on from this earth?
Possibly. I mean, if I'm understanding the question, and I just got back at the end of Charles' answer, but a victim can go into bitter resentment and live a life of deep, deep despair and depression, or they can go on and go beyond victimhood and recognize that, you know, I'm choosing not to be a victim. That's not going to be my consciousness. So I think each individual, no matter how good or horrendous the experience is, their response is going to depend on their soul-making development. There's no single right or wrong response. It's just the individual.
She just followed up and said, like the Holocaust and all those who died, are they people that are at a higher level of soul making?
Again, the question is, man. The question is,
do you need to take that, Michael?
No, I'm just kind of stressed out between worlds here. My dad is in the hospital and he's supposed to come home today. I just told my wife to give him a call, so hopefully she's doing that.
Okay.
The Holocaust, let me put it this way. The soul-making experience recognizes these hard questions and doesn't give an answer. This is the hardest part about this perspective. It spends more time honoring the discussion than it does in giving dogmatic answers. Our political situation right now could use a little soul making because we're all so damn dogmatic about what we think is the truth. There's a place for that. But the soul making perspective takes something like the Holocaust and it goes all over the map in answers and opinions and all the way from atheism, there is no God. And I go there some days. Honestly, there are days I think, I don't know if there's a God. I don't know if there's a purpose in this life. We're going to see that in mode 3 as a legitimate perspective. And the next moment I'll go to, there is purpose in life. The Holocaust has purpose. Each individual, you know, has to figure out what to do with the horrendous suffering they go through. And when you can join with God, then you can put the suffering behind you. So to me, it's the struggle that's the most important part of this soul-making lesson. And I think that's going to come more clear as we continue through these slides. Okay?
Do it.
All right. So the first mode, according to Scott Peck, is ego, chaotic, antisocial. It's all about me. Scott Peck says that comes to an end because that perspective causes so much suffering and so much pain that a person moves into what he calls, and I've got to please move this. Okay, there it's disappearing from my screen. Person moves to the second mode or stage of consciousness, which Scott Peck calls formal institutional. Now, formal institutional is what I'm calling ego plus or tribal. Formal institutional means a person in a state of ego chaos starts looking for some structure. It's the alcoholic or the drug addict who finds the 12-step meeting. The 12-step meeting is a formal institutional experience. It's good. Here's 12 steps, some form for me to follow. It's often a time when a person maybe start going to church, or they'll start a meditation group, or they'll go to college and pay somebody to make them go to class and learn, or they'll join the military. So the instructions are clear when to go to bed, when to get up, etc. Or they'll get married. So they're in a formal institutional marriage where, I have some structure in my life. So Scott Peck says this is the second stage, or a second mode of consciousness, where it's no longer all about me. It's all about what?
We.
This is a necessary stage or mode of consciousness. We expand the I to we. And as Charles said a few minutes ago, we all experience this, most of us, I think, experience this every day, where maybe I'm married or I'm in a relationship with somebody and they do something to piss me off. And immediately I go to the ego mode, which is defending myself. And then I'll click and go, oh, wait a minute, it's not all about me, it's about we. And I'll apologize and say, I'm sorry, I lost my head. And then I make the circle bigger. So this is a natural mode of consciousness. This forms and institutions. I want to find the rules. Sometimes in the New Thought movement, the Centers for Spiritual Living, I'll hear people say, I left the Christian church because they had too many rules. And I'll say, have you ever gone to the practitioner training or taken courses? There's rules in the CSL stuff too. It's formal institutional. It's not bad. It gives you some structure to work with. So Scott Peck says we go into the structure. But this mode of consciousness, or this form of spirituality, also comes to an end in that we almost always move into what he calls a third stage, which is skeptic individual. Inevitably, whenever we're in a formal institutional, whether it's a marriage or the military or college or religion, whatever, one morning we'll wake up and go, why am I doing this? Is this really the way I want to spend the rest of my life? And we start to have doubts. We start to ask questions. We start to become individuals. Because in stage 2, we're not really individuals. What are we? We're in the herd. We're in the collective. This is Confucianism in China. Confucianism is you are part of the collective. Don't do anything to stand out. Well, in stage 3, we begin to question the collective. This is when a progressive or a conservative looks at their own party and says, maybe we're not as right as we think we are. This is when somebody in a practitioner training class raises their hand and says, I don't know if I believe this or not. And some of the others look at them in horror saying, oh, what are you doing questioning the truth? So this is a natural mode of consciousness, Scott Peck says. This is a painful mode of consciousness. Can you see that? Because in stage 2, there's a kind of order and peace and clarity. It's like, I know the answers. Stage 3, there is some fear and panic and, danger that maybe I don't know the answers. It's a necessary spiritual mode. Scott Peck says, we go through skeptic individual into stage 4, which is what he calls mystic communal. And that's the place of surrender. I don't need to know all the answers. I can still have questions. I can still wonder, but I can trust that there is a purpose and a power greater than me that encircles all of reality, and I can rest in that place. Those are the 4 stages or modes that Scott Peck talks about. Before we go on in the chart, any questions as you see these 4 different modes of consciousness or 4 stages? Anybody? Anybody identify with these 4 modes of consciousness? Can you see where you can be self-obsessed, relationally, structurally fixed, questioning, and mystically connected?
Hi, Ken. My name's Audrey. Hi. Yeah, I can relate to all of them. And I definitely see how throughout my life and even in, shorter periods of time, I move through all of them.
Yes.
And it does seem like a very natural process, like one that's kind of almost built in,
Yes.
that we have to go through to completely understand ourselves.
Yes.
I don't think anyone jumped from the ego to the mystical without going through some pretty, I hate to say this, but some pretty harrowing experiences sometimes.
Yes.
And I almost think that is the purpose. I would agree that seems to be the purpose of the soul developing more self-awareness and even more self-mastery.
Yes.
It seems to be a huge piece of, my background is a lot in metaphysics. I was part of the Sufi order for like 30 years and have a lot of Eastern training. About Eastern philosophy and religion. And, one of the tenets is that your soul goes through like a laboring process before
Yes.
it can be fully awakened.
Yes.
And I agree. It seems like as human beings, we all fall back asleep and then we have to go through the process again somehow or another.
Yes, exactly right. And falling asleep is part of the process.
Yes. Yes.
So there is no wasted moment in a soul-making paradigm. And as we're going to see, the Bible goes through all 4 of these stages because they're all spiritual.
Yes.
And this is the part I think a lot of us in the New Thought movement maybe not have a problem with, is we want to reserve spirituality for which stage?
The last stage.
The last.
We believe it's the only stage that's somehow valid, but
yes,
that's not true.
Exactly. And so what ends up happening for many of us is we sort of hide the other 3 stages so people don't see them because, my God, I don't want to be perceived as unspiritual. But this perspective suggests that the divine is the energy behind the ego, behind formal institutional relationships with all their craziness, behind our skepticism and individuating. All the mythologies have a Satan or a Shiva or a Mercury or a Hermes or some character that comes in and pulls the rug out from under us. And then the mystic is also part of the spiritual. But as you said so perfectly, it's all part of the spiritual paradigm.
Yeah, there isn't really a separation in life between what is spiritual and what is not spiritual.
Well, to me, that's where I started to see that the picture of holistic, I used to see images of holistic, metaphysics or holistic philosophy. And the circle didn't seem big enough to include all of my experiences.
Yes,
Oftentimes,
agreed.
holistic meant healthy. And for me now, holistic means unhealthy and healthy and a-healthy in all the experiences. And I understand that we all want the mystic communal stage, and I believe that is the quintessential place to be when all 4 of these stages are mingled together. It's the quintessence. Quint means what?
I don't know. I didn't know
5.
that. It means what?
5.
5. Okay.
It's the
Oh,
5th.
wow.
So the
Yeah.
the quintessence is taking these 4 modes of consciousness like bits of a stew and putting all the ingredients together through a life or maybe many lives fully lived, and we become the quintessential self, the resurrected self, if you will, where our ego, our relationships, our skepticism, and our mysticism are all blended together into this incredibly fascinating, unique individual.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah. So in this view, it's not like we leave one stage behind and say, oh, now I'm done with the ego, I'm going on to the next stage. It's a matter of adding stages, like paints to a picture. The other colors are always there, but new colors are added, and the new colors change the colors before it a little bit. So when we're in the ego and we move into tribal or relational experiences, the ego changes a little bit. We move into skepticism. The prior 2 stages change a little bit. Mysticism often radically changes our skepticism, our institutionalism, and our egoism. Doesn't mean they leave us, but they usually get altered pretty radically when we start to get a mystical perspective on life. Okay, anyone else? Good conversation. All right, let's move. Let's look at these modes in Hinduism and other religions and mythologies very, very quickly. We don't have much time. So I'm going to suggest that these 4 modes of consciousness are found in Hinduism, as kama is the first stage in Hinduism. These are very clear stages within Hinduism. Kama is pleasure or desire. This is equivalent with the ego, chaotic antisocial, the lower chakra, the base, if you will. And in Hinduism, we move from desire to artha, or success, where you get married, you have a family, you work, you get involved in society and politics. This is stage 2 in Hinduism. And then in Hinduism, as you grow up and get older, you move into the Dharma stage, where you start to ask questions, you start to seek meaning, you get a guru, a teacher, and you start to really dig in to the meaning of life. And then there's moksha, or liberation, which is the equivalent of stage 4 mysticism. So it's not just in Scott Peck, and it's not just in the Bible. This is found in Hinduism. You find it in Buddhism. The Buddha was raised in the Hindu tradition. Buddha starts his life as a princely young man, filled with desires, and all of his ego needs were satisfied. He moves from there into getting tribal meditation teachers, stage 2, where he goes out and learns these meditation techniques, formal, institutional. It's not enough for him. He almost dies in his fasting, disintegrating, and he finally puts himself under the Bodhi tree, and he wakes up and becomes the budding one. Our word bud is a Proto-Indo-European root word from Buddha and budding, the idea of the flower blossoming, the lotus seed blossoms, the soul is made, if you will. Now, when it comes to the Bible, here's where we find these stages. Genesis, ego. We're going to look at this more in detail next week. After you move out of Genesis, you have all these individual characters, and it's all about each of them. Even God is in there flooding the earth and kicking people out of gardens. And so even the God image in Genesis is sort of an egoic perspective. Then you move into the book of Exodus, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers through Samuel. You have the nation of Israel forming. Tribal, stage 2, we go. So you start to read about a different perspective. God is no longer an individual working with individuals in Genesis. God is now working with the whole nation of Israel, and we get all the laws, all the forms, the tabernacle, the temple, the institutions, the 10 commandments. All the laws come because we need them in that stage. And then when you get done with the Samuel, you can move into the book of Kings and the prophets and the poets in the Old Testament, and they start to ask questions. The book of Job is in this section. Job is like, I've done all the right things and everything's gone to hell. This is just not fair. Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities. It's all vanity. There's no purpose under the heavens. Begins to ask questions. The Hebrews are so good at asking tough questions. David is in this section as a king. He has an affair with Bathsheba. He has her husband killed. He lies about it. The guy is a friggin' madman. And yet it's part of his divine unfolding. And then you come to the New Testament, which is mode 4 or stage 4. And this is from Genesis to Jesus. So when I do this class, what we do is we read through the different sections of the Bible as modes of consciousness, and it allows people to see that God grows up in Israel and God grows up in each of us. Because in Genesis, we get to focus on our egos. Exodus through Leviticus, we get to focus on our relationships and forms of institutions that we're involved in, whether it's politics or family or neighborhoods or whatever, businesses. Stage 3, the poets and the kings, we get to look at our insanities, our addictions, our neuroses, our depressions, our panics, our fears, all those things that in the New Thought movement we oftentimes say, I'm fine, thank you, it's all good, and then we go home and fall apart privately. And then in mode 4, we look at the mystic communal, those sweet moments of union with God and meditation and treatment and prayer and all that wonderful stuff that gets us connected to the divine. But what we look at is that all 4 of them are necessary. We're not going to go, but here's some other ones. Did everybody get that? We could go through many other examples of where this shows up. Even in Emma Curtis Hopkins, her pre-Christian idea was scientific materialism. And then stage 2, she wrote on analytical mental techniques, mental science. Then stage 3, chemicalization, where she talks about things falling apart. And then stage 4, in the later part of her life, she comes into this mystical union that shows up as kind of a mysticism. So here are the different books of the Bible and the 4 stages, 4 modes. We'll look at that again next Friday and sort of pick up there. Here's the same idea in the Russian nesting dolls. Down in the little tiny doll, you've got the little ego, Genesis, and then you have relationships with the next doll, Exodus through Samuel, and then you have disintegrative mode of consciousness in the next doll, ego and tribal relationships. And then you have the mystical New Testament, Jesus, and then you have the quintessential completion, that self where it's all blended together. 4 faces, 4 perspectives. Here's another beautiful image found in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. If you look at that image, beautiful image of emerging from the image of God to the likeness of God.
That's awesome, Michael.
Isn't that a beautiful image?
Totally.
All right. We've got a few minutes left here. Let's see if there's any discussion.
I'd like to say something. This is Audrey again, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So I was just thinking about these 4 stages, and the one where there's a kind of a dark night of the soul experience.
Yes.
And out of that dark night of the soul comes new strength and new understanding and new compassion and new, just more, So I'm kind of looking at this thing we're going through globally as a dark night of the soul for our whole humanity. And it feels like to me that some people will use it as a time of deep inner work and self-examination and spiritual growth, personal growth, and then other people won't. But it to me seems to have a very strong spiritual opportunity, I guess you'd say.
Yes.
And I see these stages in it.
Yes. And I like the way you put it, spiritual opportunity, because we're not going to be compelled to move forward as individuals or even as a nation or a world, but the opportunity is there to self-reflect and to see in ways that we couldn't without it. One of my favorite teachers, James Hillman, says, what we call negative emotions are the sort of psyche or soul moving us to a place of enforced self-reflection.
I love that.
Yeah. Anyone else? Overwhelmed, underwhelmed?
Oh, hi, Michael. This is Holly.
Hi.
I really appreciate your bringing this perspective. And I never had much Bible training as a child growing up in Christian Science, and then going into religious science and looking at these stages. And it's like, as they're reflected in so many different philosophies, it's really getting down to a universal truth, no matter what kind of labels you might want to put on them. It's just a stage. And going back to nature, you take the ego, and it's like the force of the seed breaking through the earth. There's chaos to that. And then going into the stalk, where there's structure, the tribal thing, and the formalized. And then when the bud comes out, that's another kind of eruption process.
Yep.
And then going back into the mystical where it blossoms and it's like, oh my word,
Yes.
sort of
Yep.
harvesting.
Yes.
So
Exactly. Beautiful application, I think. And another piece of it we'll hopefully talk about next week is the idea of growing down, because the roots have to go down before you can grow up. And again, James Hillman, one of my favorite teachers, says sometimes he'll look at somebody and say, you know what, you need to grow down.
oh, interesting.
Because we're always talking about growing up, right? We prejudice the movement upward. And I get it, because that's where we want to be. But we often ignore the growing down part, the putting the roots down into the dark soil. We call it depression. These days, I don't call it depression. I call it growing down. It doesn't mean I like it. It's still painful. It's still really awful at times. But if I can remember it's purposeful and the roots are going down to suckle from consciousness, things that I would never suckle from without it, it kind of helps me get through it.
Yeah. Interesting.
There's
So,
also, oh, sorry.
go ahead, Audrey.
Were you finished? I don't want to interrupt you.
Yes,
You
I'm
were.
finished. Thank you.
This just, your thought, your insights made me remember one of the first things I learned in mysticism, in Sufism, was there's a stage in development called the Kamal, sorry. And it's, so in Hindu, not Hindu, but in Islam mysticism, the mystical part of Islam, which what Sufism came out of, there's a stage called the Kamal, and the Kamal is a stage of uncertainty where there's nothing yet blooming, but there's been the pruning process, if you will, of God. So there's been an aspect of your life or your experience that has been pruned away, but Kamal,
That's exactly right. And again, the danger in, I think, some of our new thought groups is that we just think, well, I just need to get through this darkness so I can get to the good stuff. And I get that. There's a legitimacy there. And if we would spend more time looking at this, there's often so much to get in those moments of being pruned that if we don't get it, we'll keep going back to it, or it'll keep pulling us back into itself. All right, we've got a couple of minutes left. I probably should hand back to Jeff or Charles and let you guys do what you need to do. Thank you all for listening to me blab on about this, and please join us next week. We'll go a little deeper.
Right on. Thank you, Michael. No blabber. That's
all right.
Rich. When Michael says next week, he means Friday. So 4 days.
That's what I mean.
Yep, that's what he means. Even if he doesn't, that's what I mean that he means.
That's what I mean.
Friday morning at 10. So for part 2 of this wonderful exploration. So we're grateful to Michael for contributing to our center and to all of us that have the blessing to be on board here this morning. So I want to remind you of what's happening for the rest of the week real quick. And also first encourage you to continue to support the center. We're grateful for everybody in every way that you support the center financially. And we continue to welcome that as we move through these times. You can do it through the website, or I'm sure there's a link Jeff is providing. There are a number of ways that you can find to continue to support the center financially. And we welcome that wholeheartedly and continue to, it continues to allow us to make these offerings to you on a daily basis, every day at 10. So tomorrow is Dr. Joe and I. We'll do our weekly Q&A and hangout session. And then Wednesday again is the Sensational 6. This week, they're moving you through the process of creating vision boards. So that will be a cool offering at 10. And then on Thursday, we're still figuring out the concert and conversation, or what's going to happen Thursday at 10, but something will happen. And then Friday is part 2 of this session with Michael Bogar again, and some more wonderful information. My prayer is that we're all taking this information and bringing it into our own garden. As Michael has encouraged us to do. It's such wonderful information that's presented, and then we bring it into our own experience, right? That's the soul making process, is kind of bouncing it off. Where are you in life and what's happening? and hopefully to creating a more meaningful experience. Thursday is going to be Eddie Watkins Jr. with Dr. Joe. That's going to be a cool treat. If you haven't heard of Eddie, make sure you're there on Thursday morning.
Yeah, he is a treat.
He is a treat. Yep. So, and then Friday again is part 2 with Michael. Saturday, 10 a.m. meditation, and then of course another Sunday service at 10 on Sunday, and then we'll move into another week. I woke up yesterday morning, I walked out and I said, "It's day again." You can put whatever you want in front of day now. It's just day. So
yeah,
as we keep walking out these times, let's do it as consciously as possible. Michael, thank you again so much for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, your love, your earnestness with our community. We're very blessed and look forward to seeing you again on Monday. Thank you, pal.
thank you. My pleasure.
Okay. All right, gang. Have a beautiful week, and we will see you tomorrow at what time?
10 o'clock. Thank you very much.
All right.
Peace and love.
Have a great week.
Thanks, Michael. Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
See you guys.
Okay.